All right, this will be part 3 of a response to some comments on a recent video that I made as a response to John the Other about political violence. And I want to finish up with just some general discussion about some of these ideologies, because I think, again, to me, the terms are not all that important. They become, in the way George Orwell said about fascism, meaningless, because we just use them as pejoratives, and they're devoid of any meaning at that point. They're used, I hate the phrase dog whistle. I actually hate all of these terms, really, because of the way they're used, right? People use them to become an entity in and of itself. The meaning of it has become lost, and I'm not sure if I'm even getting that across, what I mean by that, but I'm hoping you understand what I'm saying here. They become labels that have a life of their own. They become a dog whistle. And what's more important than the label is its definition. And then when you've applied the label and you have a definition, first thing someone ought to do actually is, if you say, Nazi, go home, somebody ought to say, what do you mean by Nazi? And then they ought to say, well, what we mean is X, Y, Z. And then someone ought to say, okay, please tell me how that person meets that definition. What have they done, said, et cetera, et cetera. And this is dialogue. This is discourse. Of course, this is where the bullhorns and the banging on things and the screaming at people and the chanting come in, because they don't want to have that dialogue. And that obviously is part of the problem. And then that way it moves towards violence. One other thing that I wanted to comment about this person who was pro-punching Nazis is, again, this is the problem, because the violence gets expanded. So he says punch a Nazi at every opportunity you got, which is pointless. You're not going to stop a war by doing that. He talked about his father was a Dane who fought during World War II. You weren't going to stop World War II by punching Nazis back then, and you're not going to do it now. The problem was actually the curtailing of speech and the curtailing of opposition to different policies. I think that is one of the biggest problems we have. Sunlight's the best disinfectant. Let's get these discussions out in the open. The radical or the far left does not want that, partially I think because they don't want to be exposed for this labeling campaign that they're involved with. You can actually see, there's plenty of videos online of different people going to different rallies with people got signs about Nazis and fascism and all different kinds of things. They'll pose a few questions to them, and they're bereft of any real content in their responses. They've got nothing. They don't even know what they're fighting for. Some of them will even say, oh, well, somebody made this sign for me. If you find yourself holding a sign that has some political slogan on it that you didn't make and haven't put any thought into, you might be fighting for the wrong cause. Or you might be doing the wrong thing, right? You ought to not only know your own position extremely well and be able to defend it at any given time, challenged by somebody, but you actually ought to know fully your opponent's point of view. And again, as I said in the last video, the best version of it, not some straw man idea of it. If you really expect to be able to engage in any meaningful way, rather than just trying to browbeat people into submission, which is, I think, what's going on here. So the terms have to have a real definition to them. The definition is what's important, not the label. And people ought to be willing to defend those. So if we try to apply those terms correctly, we watch different people, like Steven Crowder was recently talking to a reporter of some sort and talked about alt-right personality Steven Crowder, and he was talking about this incident where he confronted somebody who I think was threatening them on Twitter, something like that, at a coffee shop, and she was writing about this, and he's challenging this notion of alt-right. And I think it's important to do that because, again, this is another alt-right becomes Nazi, especially now when you see the video that I saw tonight for the first time, where a guy says the first precept of the alt-right is gas the kikes, race war now. Well, okay, if I'm a conservative-minded person, which I am to some degree, and I've got libertarian and liberal views as well, and someone is labeling me alt-right, and I'm not for this first precept, then I better stand up in my own defense and say, oh, excuse me, I am not that, and you need to show me, explain to me why it is you've given me that label, because the label is fucking dangerous in this particular landscape. Nazi, white supremacist, alt-right, those are all becoming very dangerous terms to have stuck to your person, right? And so it's really important. Now, I find it interesting as well, though, that some of these things don't deserve even, I think, the level of animus given them. And that's not that I'm saying I support them. It's just that, again, hate shouldn't really be illegal. You can't make an emotion illegal. You can't make even, I mean, really, it's probably an emotion based on misunderstanding or misinformation. So can you make misinformation and misunderstanding illegal? You know, we recently had a motion passed here. It's an anti-Islamophobia motion. How can you be anti a phobia? How can you be anti a fear? Now, people are probably misusing that term. The phrase doesn't mean what it literally says it means, but that's all the more confusing, and nobody wanted to define that term either. So this is the problem, right? We seem to have lost the ability to engage in discourse where we clarify our terms and we demand people defend their claims. That's gone. It's been replaced by labels. And, even things like white nationalism, well, I don't particularly agree with it. I find that a lot of these things on the left are viewed through, a very particular lens. For instance, nationalism is bad. Unless you're, nationalists in Africa or in Japan or something like that, nobody's really too concerned about that. And I mean, some of the nationalism that's going on in some African countries is pretty genocidal. I mean, that has been verbalized by leaders of countries. And certainly activists in those countries. Nobody's saying punch them, right? You can make the argument, well, they're not in America, and that's fine, but the principle ought to stand, and somebody ought to be concerned about those things. Plenty of people are concerned about what's happening in other countries, so I don't necessarily buy the objection completely. But the bottom line is labeling people and then dismissing them en masse is a very dangerous thing to do. And I would just encourage people to be very wary of doing that. You need to be very careful about labeling people in this way, because the mob will never be satisfied. The mob, in a lot of ways, I think, may consist of a lot of very hurt people. And it also may consist of people who are actually seeking political power of some sort. And when you're dealing with people like that, they'll probably never be satisfied. I've said long ago, and I've said many times, that any group, whether it be, like the Cancer Society or MS Society or feminists or, any group that is Black Lives Matter, any group that has gathered together around a cause ought to have as its first premise, the first precept of this cause ought to be its eradication. That ought to be the first priority of the cause, because that would mean that whatever the goal is that you set your focus on had been achieved. That should be the day, that ought to be the victory celebration, is we're disbanding. We're fucking done. We fucking did it. Wow, yay us. That's not how it works, unfortunately. There's just becomes a shift in focus, right? And it usually is a mission creep. It usually is never going to be disbanded. And so the mob is never going to be satisfied. And so, as I said in the videos past, if you think you're part of the mob, just wait, because the mob will be coming for you next. And that we've seen that. I mean, that happens all over the place. I wish people would keep their eyes on their own paper, I wish people would just live their own lives and leave other people the hell alone. I think that is one of the hallmarks of one of the best aspects of a true anarchist libertarian philosophy. The non-aggression principle is something that we would all do well to adopt. And I know a lot of people that criticize the non-aggression principle, but I think if we all held that in high regard, you wouldn't have these problems, of course, The problem is that we don't, and not enough of us hold the non-aggression principle in high enough esteem to make any reasonable difference. All right, I've already ended this video in a different way, and I've gone back and watched it, and I've decided that I'm going to change the ending. And unfortunately, it's going to maybe be a bit of a downer, because I don't really see a clear way out of the mess that we're in right now. If we go back in time to when I was talking about misusing the tool, I think the criticism was very similar back then, that we were sticking labels on people and using personal attacks as an attempt to dismiss their arguments. That way we don't have to deal with them, and that I felt that this was a misuse of the tool, the internet. Fast forward to today, and this has spread into all kinds of discourse all over the place. Physical discourse, which has become non-discourse. And the labels have been used to dismiss people, and now the labels are being used to as an excuse for violence, as license, if you will, to commit violent acts against people. And then the terms get expanded, and so now recently we've had police officers and journalists being attacked. And the chants now have become like all cops are racist, you better face it. More of these chants. And I've said in the response to John the Other that the everyday average reasonable people don't support these things, these notions of that all cops are racist. Most people have police officers in their family, or they've been helped by police officers, or they believe generally in the rule of law. And I would say to the person who had said, punch Nazis at every opportunity you got, you either have the rule of law or you have vigilantism, but you can't have both, right? So be careful about the choices that you're making here. With that kind of speech. The rule of law says that people have the right to defend themselves against accusations, and people are innocent until proven guilty. And if you want to retreat to vigilantism, be fucking careful, because again, the mob will come for you. And it may be a right-wing mob, it may be a left-wing mob, whatever. It's going to be some self-interested mob, and they are coming for you. It's bizarre that we have to have these discussions. Wow. Anyway, so when the scope gets broadened out to include, the police and journalists, it's pretty self-evident here what's taking place. Anyone in our way, as the other commenter said that I suggested you read their longer form comment, said, you're either us or you're them, and you better toe the line, or we will label you as them. We will label you as other, and that becomes very dangerous. So much in the same way as I said earlier that everyday average reasonable people don't support the notion that all cops are racist, for instance, and certainly don't support journalists being attacked for simply recording an event, that sort of thing. Everyday average reasonable people don't support what these alt-right people were saying, about where the ovens and that sort of thing. They would be every bit as shocked and appalled as I was at watching that video earlier this evening. And so I think the best thing you can do is expose these ideas to the light of day and let the ostracism of the public square do its thing. And only take action on things that are actually actionable, which generally is action. Inciting to violence, direct incitements to violence, and actual plotting and planning to enact violence. And the reason that I don't hold out much hope at the moment is because it's pervasive now in our society. We've got the mainstream media now endorsing these things. People like Chris Cuomo talking about there's no moral equivalence between Antifa wanting to enact violence and the radical far right. Well, there may be no moral equivalence, but first of all, again, once again, you've appointed yourself judge and jury, and Antifa is executioner, and how did you get to be sole arbiter of what constitutes a Nazi, for instance? Second of all, again, I don't see how you can make hatred illegal. And if you're going to do that, I wonder how it is that people allow themselves to be so inconsistent in their application of this. What about the recent polls that return results in high percentages of people of certain religious ideologies that say that homosexuality ought to be punishable by death? If you were to say, should we run around punching them? I'm certain that they would say, well, that's just their belief, but you can't punish them for their beliefs. They haven't taken action against any homosexuals, so therefore you ought to leave them be. I mean, these things ought to be consistent. The principles have to be consistent for it to be meaningful in any way, and people seem to like to choose when to apply certain principles and when not to. That's 15. Thanks for watching.